Hello, people are showing up. It's time for
Yay.
something to talk about. And it's time to talk about gardens and fall and winter. Ooh. But this is something to talk about from the Bainbridge Island Senior Community Center. We are sponsored by Fieldstone Communities of Bainbridge Island. Fieldstone offers innovative and compassionate care. They have day stay and respite programs also up at their facility on Rolling Bay. To schedule a tour or learn more, call 360-689-4314. And I also would like to acknowledge that we are on the ancestral homeland of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Suquamish tribe, the people of the clear salt water. We honor them and we are grateful for their hospitality. We are also grateful for the presence of Ann Lovejoy, who's going to kick off another discussion of how to make life better through gardening.
Thanks, Reed. Yeah, I think pretty much all you have to do to make life better through gardening is to give it a shot. Even, one of the things I've been reading about a lot lately is that there's amazing research that says even if you're not a good gardener, it's still good for you, which I thought was really interesting. So it's like a gardener who's a newbie and plants stuff and it doesn't all live. It doesn't matter. It's not about win or die in that sense necessarily. It's about having your hands in the soil, looking at plants, getting to know how they work. And all that is just essentially really good for our health and well-being. It's kind of fascinating. And, until you're a better gardener, it might not be great for the plants' health and well-being, but down the road, yeah, as we start to pay attention and sort of go, oh, maybe it didn't need more water. Maybe the reason that it's not looking so good is because the saucer is still full after 3 days of extra water, right? And you start to go, oh, yeah, maybe not so much. And learning is, that's part of the whole joy of it, really. But I think it's really important to remember that you might not succeed fabulously the very first time.
I know that I've made a lot of friends this year with the rabbits and other critters that come to share my garden with me.
Absolutely. But one thing I was just going to say, like, there's something about a new beginning that sometimes gives you an incredible result, partly perhaps because you're using fresh soil, you're digging in a place that has never been gardened before, it's not exhausted yet, and you get this great result. And then the next year it's not so good. And you're like, well, what happened? But it's that learning to replenish, learning that everything needs renewal, learning that soil needs help too, indoors and out. I mean, that's something to think about. Like as we close down the season, I'm going to start talking a little more about houseplants and stuff too. But yeah, figuring out that our gardens are an exercise in frustration sometimes when the rabbits come, when the deer come, when the neighbor kids come, when somebody plays soccer in the backyard. Those things cannot feel so good. But I think the overall balance is going to be really positive when you start thinking about how much we can benefit. Even like maybe your garden wasn't the best you ever had, but maybe the rabbits are loving it, and maybe the bees are loving it, and maybe the deer are really grateful. And it's like, maybe that's not a bad thing, right? It isn't always only about us. So that's part of it. But I did want to talk a little about, several people have said to me, when do I give up on the tomatoes? And, we've been hearing, okay, it's going to get colder. Okay, it's going to start raining. Okay, maybe not. Okay, yeah, right? And it just comes and goes. And we had rain 100% on Friday. Well, 60% on Friday. Well, 50%, who knows? So the thing is, you don't have to pull up all your plants in anticipation. Wait until they really need it, right? You don't want to wait too long after the rain and cold come. And it has been getting cold at night. When it dips down in the 40s like that, you're going to see foliage on the tomatoes are going to get yellow, sometimes even black. They're not happy. So that's when it's a good time. And the whole plant just seems to kind of sag. Don't try to feed it. It's like that ship has sailed. Instead, you can start harvesting the tomatoes. And, if they're not ripe, one of the best ways you can deal with them is to put them in a little egg carton and don't close the top. Leave it open, because keeping them apart from each other with a dry bottom and air circulation around them will keep them from getting funky. If you just put them on a piece of newspaper or on a plate, sometimes the bottom will start to sag. You'll get mold and mildew, and it's gross. But if you put them in a little egg carton, which Lord knows we probably all have many of, that will allow them to ripen properly. And if you put on this side a banana, you will find they ripen extremely well, because bananas, as they ripen, produce ethanol gas, which is a ripening agent for pretty much everything. So if you have your little banana on one side and your little tomatoes on the other side, you're going to see them turning red faster than you might otherwise. And if they just don't, and they just want to stay green, that's okay too. Because as we've talked about before, there's some amazing things you can do with green tomatoes, not just fried in cornmeal and that, but I just love them slow roasted. And, usually Sheila's here to cheer this on because she's done it a few years and it really is delicious. Because if you do them slow, just like cut them in half, put the cut side up, rub on a little teeny bit of olive oil, or I like avocado oil because it's a less aggressive flavor, and put them at 225 in a sheet pan with a rim, because you don't want them dripping all over the oven, believe me. But a rimmed baking sheet will hold all those excess juices if they start to get runny. But do them for like a couple hours and they'll slightly caramelize, which brings out all the latent sugars in them. And then what you do is brilliant. You freeze them. And I personally like to use these extremely successful freezer containers, which happen to come with that Katia organic ice cream. Now, I wouldn't eat ice cream just for no reason, but if you're eating it because you're going to get a really nice freezer container out of it.
Yes.
I mean, they're good and they still snap. Do you hear that snap?
Yes, and I really appreciate the excuse for the ice cream. I'm going to use that.
It's kind of your gardener's duty.
That's right.
These are awesome containers. And when you freeze stuff in them, it really stays clean and nice and they don't get the seepage of off freezer flavors. And they're free. And I've reused them sometimes for years, though they do need to be replenished periodically. Like every time that Katia ice cream goes on sale, it's a good time to pick up a few more, right? This is one other thing you can do.
I was just going to add that I noticed that in maybe not the most recent, but a couple posts back on your blog, Green Gardening with Ann Lovejoy, you have this recipe. So about slow roasting.
Yeah. And I tweak it every now and then, but it's basically the same thing. Like you can put a little sea salt on there if you want. You can actually crumble on some oregano or chop up a little thyme. All those things add to it. When you're freezing stuff, though, the purer the flavor, the better it is. And do not, this is a great time to do pesto and freeze it. And I usually freeze it in a dedicated ice cube tray. I have one with a heavy silicone flap that kind of flips over the top and seals it in. And then when you pop out those cubes, then you put them in your handy dandy ice cream box. And then you can add just it's about a tablespoon and a half to each thing you want to do, or thaw 4 or 5 of them and make a little pesto. But when you do that, you just want to do the basil leaves and you don't want to do the garlic with it. So if you're making the pesto ahead, you can I use walnuts actually most of the time, but pine nuts are really expensive, which is really reasonable if you consider that they're pine nuts come from inside a pine cone. Okay. So someone has to wait till the pine cone starts to ripen, put it in a dry place till it pops open, shake out all those little seeds, clean them. And by that time you're looking at $40 a pound, right? If on the other hand, some of the other kinds of nuts that are you can do peanuts, you can do walnuts, you can do pecans, you can do anything you want. But the important piece is not freezing them with garlic, because garlic freezers are not kind to garlic. It really goes off pretty fast. So you could do it if you were going to use them again in a few weeks. But if you're looking at a few months, as most of us probably are, no, just do the basic of, you could do some cheese, some nuts, the basil, and some salt. And one of the key things is when you grind the basil up, grind it with the salt first. And what that does is it retains the green color and it doesn't discolor as fast or as much. Whereas if you pour all the ingredients in together, they oxidize and it turns into that kind of slightly mysterious, funky brownish green, which is okay. But if you want the fresher green, then you want to freeze it like that. And I put just a little film of the avocado oil or something over the top of each of the ice cubes when they're set. And that seals it in and then they don't oxidize. That makes sense? I know, it's a good thing.
Yeah, sounds like a delicious idea.
It is. And basil's one of those plants that you're going to want to pull in pretty quick, because it starts dipping down in the night, it starts turning black and looks really unhappy. So when I start making the pesto cubes or stuff like that, I'm also going to make some basil salt. And I've talked about this before. I like to make it really heavy duty. Like you can get this in the store and it sort of basically looks like salt with a little teeny green flecks in it. No, I want it to be green with little teeny white flecks in it. So I'm doing like 2 cups of foliage and 2 cups of kosher salt. I like kosher salt these days because it's mined and it doesn't have any plastic in it. And I'm really sorry to say that sea salt anymore usually has a lot of plastic in it. Tiny, but it's there. Just another one of those things. But anyway, if you grind up, and like I said, it's about a 1-to-1 relationship. Again, you get out your trusty rimmed baking sheet, spread the salt stuff out, and you can do it. I also do it with, this is garlic and rosemary. That's another big favorite. Sometimes I'll do lemon, peppercorns, and a little garlic, right? On all those things. And the same thing is you want to roughly equivalent amounts of salt and cool stuff. Grind it all up in your Cuisinart or whatever you have. You could use a blender even, really. And then you spread it out on that rimmed baking sheet. And again, it's 225, so it's pretty low. Most ovens can do 225. In about 20 minutes, it'll start crusting over. And if you tap it, it will like break into sheets. And then so when you grind it all up and do all that cool work, don't wash the quiz or the blender or whatever it is, because then you'll have to dry the whole thing off, and that is hard. If you just leave it alone, you clean it out as best you can, you bake the stuff off, and then you put the crusty bits back in and quiz it for just like a couple seconds. Suddenly you have this beautiful salt, which keeps really well as long as it's sealed, has a good seal on it. And you can buy these little, shaker things at Town and Country or some of the other grocery stores, or maybe Rite Aid, places like that. I mean, Ace. But what's great about it is they make really good gifts. You just want to remember, like, label it some way. If you do cute labels later, you just want to be sure you know what you're giving somebody, because some people can't do garlic, some people, whatever. You want to make sure you have the right labels on, and you might want to do cuter labels than this, because I got to say, this is very effective. You know exactly what it is. But I don't know that it's like gift worthy. Rita's laughing at me because she does cute and I do sloppy fast. But before I gave this to somebody, I probably would make a really nice little label. And
yes, you would.
I would. Yeah, I do. And you can get those at the like hardware store too, right? But anyway, that's a great way to do something effective and delicious and make a nice little gift out of your harvest. And again, I would start looking at the basil because it's starting to get really dippy down into the 40s. And that's when you're going to see it turning black or getting funky. And when you're grinding it up for salt or something like that, you can use some of those older little leaves that are turning a little yellow. It doesn't matter. They still have good flavor. They just don't look that great. You can use them and grind them all up and have them as part of the mix, right? For pesto or salt. Does that make sense? Yeah. Another thing I'm harvesting right now is calendula petals. And you can probably see. So when the calendulas start to go off and they get, the petals are, they start to get shriveled a little bit, but they're still pretty colorful and good. I harvest those and save them. And I get about a quart of them, right? And then you get some coconut oil, unrefined coconut oil, which is less expensive than refined coconut oil because you're going to refine it. And then you melt it down in a big double boiler over really low heat and dump in. And I do about the same amounts again, something like this is a 23 ounces, but close enough, and about a quart of calendula petals, and let it steep for about an hour and a half, 2 hours, and then strain it all out. Now, this is an extremely messy process, I just want to say, or at least it is the way I do it. But you strain it out and filter it, and I'll take a fine mesh sieve and line it with 2 or 3 layers of cheesecloth. So you're really going to get all the petals and any gunge out of there. And then what you have is this kind of golden liquid, right? Which as it hardens, turns into this beautiful salve. And I keep it in the freezer or the refrigerator, just that. Yeah. So I keep it in the fridge in these little jars, which are cool. And they make wonderful gifts too, but this is like the best stuff for your skin. I have rosacea. And so sometimes people say, oh, you've been drinking a little early today. And I go, no, I'm not actually drinking. I'm just naturally pinking. But so you just scrape it with your fingernail. It melts immediately at your body heat, and it makes a wonderful, wonderful face salve, which is great also for if you have scrapes that have healed over and are not open anymore, or sunburn, or you burn yourself, then this is really a wonderful, easy thing to do. That is a really nice, safe, what would you say, like a crafty gift to maybe offer friends and neighbors. So that's another thing. Rita.
It's also great for your feet, especially in winter. Put some on, put some little socks on in the evening, or you can go to bed and for overnight, and it does wonders for your feet.
Oh, you're right. And putting your socks on is a super good idea, because otherwise your sheets are going to be covered with coconut oil. Let me just mention that.
Yeah.
You could ask me how I know that, but I sprained my ankle a few weeks ago, and I've been rubbing the CBD ointment in, and I know people who make that. I have not made it myself, but it's the same kind of thing with CBD oil mixed into a waxy or oil base. And boy, you put that on and it's so good for your tendons and everything else. But if you don't wear a little sock, you're making a huge mess. So yeah, thank you, Rita. That is a very good point. Another thing I kind of wanted to talk about with the tomatoes was, if you're feeling like you have a lot of them, that roasting thing we talked about a little earlier is a really good way to handle them. But if you don't have that many, it's really worth doing the slow ripening with the banana thing we talked about, because they still, as they ripen, they still have that real flavor. So they're, grocery store ones never quite measure up unless they're island grown and we're getting them right off the farm. But for that really good flavor, it is worth picking those last ones and letting them ripen up in the house. Sometimes, though, you get a huge ton of them, and that's when it's probably time to make pasta sauce or something like that. And there are always neighbors, and there's always helpline to hand off excess wonderfulness, right? There's people who would be thrilled to have a few cups of fresh produce like that. So that's something to think about. Beans, too. It's like the beans are, if you were doing beans for soup, or dry beans, because you like, flageolet or something like that, then this is a good time to start looking at the pods are starting to get leathery and the leaves are starting to yellow up. And again, you don't feed them. You don't try to bring them back. This is when you're going to let them really get dry. And I don't usually pull the plants until at least a few of them are starting to actually split. The pods get dry enough that they start to split along the seam a little bit. And that's when you can pull the whole thing, and you can just pull the plant and hang it upside down in like a burlap sack, not a plastic sack, because if it's plastic or something like that, it'll just get moldy and funky. But burlap is sort of a traditional, and you keep the top fairly open and just hang it on the wall with bean, and then you can literally shake the plants and they'll pop and shed their little beans or peas or whichever you got in there. And then you can compost the rest of the plant. But that has always been kind of fun. We used to do it in a big barrel, a 55-gallon barrel that we had, and it'd hang the plants over, and then the kids could whack them with sticks. Huh, what's more fun than that, right? So Reed, that's a good grandchild fun thing to do, hitting
Right.
the things with sticks.
Yeah, that's always a good idea. Let's beat that up, a piñata sort of idea.
Well, and it makes kids realize that some parts of gardening is fun. And, right.
So I'm wondering about things that we might be planting, like, for example, bulbs. This would be probably a good time to think about that, right?
Yeah. And the interesting thing about bulbs is it is dry out there. And so when you're planting, you're going to see the soil is just dry as dust. You don't need to water for the bulbs. If you were trying to actually plant a late start of kale or something, you could certainly do that, but you would definitely want to water, and not just the whole, because all that dry soil just sucks the water out like a sponge. But if you're planting bulbs, you can trust them to do their own job and just go ahead, but dig down. And if you're really seeing how dry it is, that's a clue that, yeah, the rains may come, but waiting for the rain starts to be a loser's game after a while. You can lose plants before the rains come. So go ahead and do some watering. If you see that it's really, really dry, like not for the bulbs necessarily, but for surrounding plants. Even some of the native plants are looking very stressed. We're seeing salal, especially, and even some of the sword ferns really struggling in a way that no one has seen, like ever, that we know of. So that as you're planting your bulbs, you do want to kind of think about that. We used to say, be sure they have good drainage. I'm like, not worried about good drainage right now. They got nothing but drainage. And as my little one used to say, pointy side up, right?
And I know that there are a lot of daffodils that people have planted along. Do they do well here? And John Close?
Yeah. You know what's interesting about the daffodils is that they actually have naturalized to some extent. And a lot of them were planted many years ago. There was a Native American Suquamish woman named Mary Sam, who was a midwife and often traded. She had a cabin in the woods between Madison and forget what that road is on the other back side of it. But the Crutch family lived back there, and the cabin had fallen, but you could still see the foundation. And around the foundation of the cabin, even when I lived over on Madison, was surrounded by daffodils. So those bulbs were already like 100 years old or more, right? But the Crutch family decided they wanted to kind of commemorate Mary Sam and honor her. So they started giving out like 5,000 daffodil bulbs every year to anybody who would plant them along the roads of Bainbridge Island. Well, some of them did great, and some of them have been completely swallowed up by blackberries and ivy and stuff like that. But even in some of those places, you will still see little bursts of yellow in, March, April along the roadsides. And at times I helped with some of that project, and we'd get like kids from Hyla School or Cub Scout troops to take 1,000 bulbs and, do clusters of 10 all along. And at one point, somebody wrote to the paper and said it was disgraceful to plant non-native aggressive territorial plants that would take over the world. And it's like, yeah, that's not daffodils, actually. You can plant those and not feel bad about it. But I love that they're kind of a heritage plant, that they really do hang on and don't need great soil and don't need a lot of attention. They do, I admit, do better without ivy and blackberry over their heads. But the old farmhouse I lived in when we first moved here out on Madison had clumps of daffodils, like 4 or 5 kinds, that had been there for at least 100 years. I mean, that's pretty great, right? And one of the fun things is that most of the daffodils that we planted to honor Mary Sam were called King Alfred type, which are really hardy, and they're the very classic yellow with, the 5 petals and the golden corona. And those are just tough as nails, and they really do naturalize extremely well, as long as you do not plant them where they're going to get too wet and be soggy in the winter. It's okay if they're moist, they want that. But if you have areas of the lawn that are, seasonal ponds, that's not the place. You don't want to put them, you can put them on the top of a rain garden, but not on the bottom of a rain garden, for instance, right?
All right. There's a question in the chat from Marianne about tete-a-tete daffodils.
Yeah. Yeah, they actually are very persistent. And again, they're small. So one of the things about the tete-a-tetes is the bulbs are little, and you don't want to plant them deep. Like big bulbs, some people say, should be 6, 8, 10, 12. It turns out that actually bulbs will move themselves to the height they really prefer. So you don't really need to dig down a foot to plant them. In fact, some studies show that you can, what the growers started doing is like leveling their fields, raking them out, basically running the tiller through just to rake, and then planting the bulbs and then covering them with compost. Bing, that's it, right? And that they would actually be as productive that way. I think they need a little more soil here, but the tete-a-tete bulbs being quite small, those are very persistent, and they are really reliable. They bloom, generally speaking, they're going to bloom like the middle of January or a little later than that, but in January almost every year. And they're also really good in pots and containers, as long as you don't try to plant something else with them that is going to be a summer bloomer that needs summer water. So when you do those kind of seasonal pots, you want to make sure that they get to be, they get to dry out and have they used to call it the summer baking, right? Or they'd say, put them under the potting table and let them be dry out. Well, I have found over the years that if you're going to do that, you also really, really, really want to label the pot, or you'll end up going, oh my God, what was this? Throw it away, or throw it in the compost heap and then go, oh, how was all those bulbs? Which one was it? I wonder, right? So that blue painter's tape that I use for my fancy things, that stuff is great for the side of a pot too. It will stick on. You can write with a big heavy marker, not little thin one that's going to fade so you can't read what you actually wrote. But that reminds you what you did and why. Like just now, I'm bringing out the pots that have the hardy cyclamen in them, and they're dormant all summer. You don't see anything, and all of a sudden, you start to see the flowers come up, like little sort of reflexed, astonished butterflies that are fluttering in the wind, and then the beautiful leaves patterned comes out too. But all summer, those look like nothing, and if you haven't labeled them, you might easily think, "Oh, I could stick a petunia in there," and then so much for your hardy cyclamen, right?
Looks like Rita, you have your hand up.
I do. I bought some tete-a-tetes 2 years ago in little pots, and I had some bigger pots, and I left them in there, and I just fixed them up, and they were great. Then I took those pots out, let them dry out for the winter, and then last spring or last fall, I planted them. They all came back up again, and then after they got done, I dug them up and I got them in kind of a open bag, and they're dried out, so I'm getting ready to put them back in. But they have been fabulous, and they are in January, when you're looking at them, they're just so happy, and they just are awesome. So go for it.
Yeah, and we actually put some in at the senior center in the back, I think, because they are so tough and so resilient.
Right.
And yeah, I think every year I'll stick in a few more just because they're so darn cheerful. And Marianne said she was thinking about a sugarless treat for Halloween that might, and would little bag of bulbs be good? I think that probably depends on the kid, whether they have the support at home to do anything with them. I've had the experience of giving children seeds and even gone to the length of having trays of little pots with soil in them with the seeds, and still maybe at home there might not. This was during the pandemic when maybe people didn't have quite as much extra time as they thought they were going to, because they were all busily trying to figure out how to work online. But anyway, unless you have a pretty close relationship with that kid, I'm not sure that would be the coolest. But you know what might be really fun would be to give kids a start of a little house plant, like, you know, little jade plant, easiest thing in the world to snap off a piece and root them, or you know, the holiday cactus plants, right? Those, a little teeny piece of that, you snip it off and stick it in soil. My grandkids love to do that, and they root really fast. I'm not sure you'd get them rooted by Halloween, but you know, you might actually, because they really are speedy little suckers. And maybe that's a fun little gift. And little cute pots are fun. And maybe a child would think that was awesome, right? To protect it, you might want to put it in a tissue or something, you know, so that there's maybe a cone of, I don't know, I'm trying to think quickly, because if you just dropped it in your treat bag, it would probably blow up and make a mess. But if you had a cone of cardboard and then tissue paper around it and a ribbon, that would look really cute and might be a fun treat, right?
Fun idea. Yeah. Certainly for people that you know that are coming by to trick or treat.
Yeah. I think, you know, little plants are fun for everybody. So, you know, maybe a tiny pansy in a little pot or something like that, that they can see right away. That would be sweet.
So I am wondering about if I want to share dahlias that I've been growing. Is this a good time to look at that, or is that something later in the year?
Well, you know, nobody knows what the weather's actually going to do, but here's the deal. Most of the dahlias are still like booming, right? They're in full bloom. They're really still carrying on wonderfully. So it's not the best time to divide a plant when it's in bloom, because it's hormonally, it's going that way, right? It's sending up the messages in through everything that it's all about the flowers. If you wanted it to, if you were planning on dividing them, you might at fairly soon think about, because they're going to be one of the flowers that will get hit if we get a frost. You know, if it dips down into the 30s, the dahlias will look funky. The roots will be fine most of the time. Some of the older ones were a little tricky to get through the winter, but I noticed this year when it was 17 degrees, and I thought, oh, well, so much for our dahlias at the senior center. They're huge, they're enormous, they're fabulous. And the ones at the library, just fine. So I know that there's been breeding efforts over the last 40 or 50 years actually to make dahlias more frost resistant in the bulb, but the flowers are still not. So one of the things you might want to do, and maybe this is a Halloween thing, Marianne, is make little bouquets of, you know, wrap the stems with some raffia or something like that and give out a little bouquet of dahlias as a Halloween treat that doesn't have any sugar in it. Because having a big, glorious end of the summer display in the house is really fun too, or take them to some of the nursing homes or something like, neighbors who are shut in. That's a fun way to do it. And then cut all the buds off, not just the blooms that are in bloom. Everything that looks like it might be trying to bud, just take all that off and let the leaves, because they're putting, as they yellow and turn soft and brown, they're actually putting nutrients back into the storage bulb, right? Roots. And so as they've kind of yellow off, then you can cut them low, take all that stuff off, let them dry out a little bit, dig up that root and put it in a garage or someplace like that so it can dry out. And then when you're dividing them, it's kind of like a potato, like each chunk of the root, they have like a finger full of roots, right? I mean, a handful of little fingers. Each one needs an eye, just like a potato. When you're cutting up the potato, you have to have an eye on that piece of potato or it won't turn into a new plant. So when you're doing dahlias, you want to make sure that each one has has some stem on it and that there's a little bud. It'll be tiny because it'll be dormant, but look to see, make sure that because I once was at it was kind of sad. It was like a wonderful fundraiser thing in this place that was famous for its dahlias and had volunteers cut up all the dahlia plants, but they didn't know that. So they were selling blind, we call that blind bulbs that are not going to bloom. You don't want to do that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's good to know. That's very good to know. I have a related question sort of about helping some of your ornamental plants be in good shape for the winter. What kinds of things might I do with my rather unruly and free range roses?
Well, with roses, one of the big important things is that they will keep blooming around here until frost comes. And with some of them are on the tender side, some of them are tough as nails. Really kind of depends. But generally speaking, the older ones that are still persistent are pretty tough. But even so, in order for the plant to sort of chemically shift from producing blossoms to hardening off the canes for winter, you want to take the blossoms and buds off. So there again is an opportunity for another little harvest moment where you have a bunch of pretty roses and buds. And you can dry them, you can use them for lots of things. You can make lotion like we talked about, the coconut oil and the calendula petals. You can also do that with rose petals. And then you get like a pale pink cream that has the rose scent in it, which is so nice. So you could do that with your late roses. But leave the canes pretty high, because if it's going to be cold and you're going to get winter kill, you don't want to have cut it way back and have the winter kill it down to the base. And then you get, if it's grafted, you get the base thing and all you have a ton of small, funky red or pink flowers that have very little scent because they're the rootstock, not what you thought you were having. Does that make sense? So leave the canes pretty tall. When you cut them at an angle, not flat across, but cut them at a slant so that it helps. I mean, it sounds like it's silly, but it does. It helps water run off instead of pooling in the flat cut the way they sometimes can. Yeah. It can be a rot zone. Does that make sense? And then yep. One other thing that's really important with roses is they are very susceptible to powdery mildew and black spot and all those icky things. So you want to be really diligent about raking out the leaves as they fall off, especially if there's any sign of disease or gunge. You can still put them in the green waste because commercial composting cycles get hot enough that they can kill that off and they won't be harboring it. But if it's just lying there, I always say leave the leaves. Well, don't. Not in this case, because if you leave those leaves, or same with like your apple trees or pear trees, if they've got foliage diseases, you do not want them to spend a nice, wet, yummy, sort of mild winter growing like crazy, so that when spring comes, here they are. All those pests and problems can overwinter really happily in fallen leaves. Now, that doesn't mean like globally, you can't do that. I still collect all kinds of leaves from trees, especially, and from plants like in the garden itself, plants that are not diseased, you can certainly put those in your compost. But unless your home compost gets really, really hot, like steaming hot, it's probably not hot enough to kill off some of those fungal disorders. So put them in the green waste, or find someone who will share their green waste with you, but don't put them in your compost unless you're a very confident, skillful composter.
Okay, and I'm not. So so if I avoid putting the diseased foliage in my compost, then I should, and I have nice healthy compost, I could put that back around my roses, right?
That's the next step. Yeah. And so if you have nice, healthy compost, I do put that around. And remember that a lot of the feeder roots are not like at the neck of the plant, but out where the drip line is, right? Or the drip line would be if you hadn't just cut all the branches off. So kind of remember that's where it is. And it's not just the zip drip line. It's like a belt that extends on both sides of the drip line of living feeding roots. But a lot of them are on the outer side. So you want to go a little beyond, and I usually say for a shrub, it might be a 2 to 3 foot band. For a tree, like a apple or pear tree, that's where I would put compost pretty deep in a nice band of maybe 3 feet wide. With a rose bush, it could be 18 inches or 12 inches, but you just want to make sure that the good stuff is where the feeder action is. And you can then put a little compost over the rest of it because you've been raking all these fallen leaves off, right? And you want to restore that soil and replenish it. So, but it doesn't need to be deep around the actual crown of the plant, right?
Okay, thank you very much.
You are welcome. I was going to say a few things about houseplants while I was at it, because I noticed that after this very smoky period, many of my houseplants have a little, not just dust, but kind of it's sticky. Like even though we have a HEPA filter running, I think there's, some smoke residue on some of my houseplants. So I get a soft rag and just plain water and just really gently dust and, remove that. And if you need to use soap, just use it extremely mild. I use Dr. Bronner's Castile soap, that liquid Castile soap, just a couple drops, or baby shampoo, super, super mild. And you don't ladle it on, but just a little teeny bit in water, and that'll take off the oil. If there's an oily base to the smoke, or the pollen is also very sticky. But this is a great time to do that for your houseplants because they can use a lift, and they perform better when they're clean. And I'm not calling anybody a bad housekeeper, but I'm just saying it's this time of year, after in the smoky season, it's a really good time to make sure. And if you have big plants that are hard to move, it can be a little complicated. And rather than get on a ladder yourself, I might get my grandkids to do it because they're young and agile, and they would think that was hilarious, right? Spread out a drop cloth, and let them go at the big ficus, right? Also, it's time to start feeding certain houseplants, especially things like jasmine, which is a wonderful plant that can live in an unheated greenhouse. But if you want it to bloom abundantly, you wanted to give it a resting period over the summer, and then you start giving it little gentle feed. And I like Dr. Earth for indoor plants. There's both liquid. Rita, you've used that liquid stuff, right?
Right. There's one that's 111, and I got it at Safeway. Ace has it too. And I found it at Safeway, little better price. And it is just amazing what that stuff does. And I mix it half of what it says with the water, just because usually it's, we don't need that much. And so it's really awesome. And Dr. Earth, we've used it around our house for outside stuff too, like for fertilizer and stuff. And it's great.
And things like the Christmas cactus, so-called, or if you want to get great bloom on those, a little mild fertilizer about once a month, and watering only about once a week, really, for the most part. Most houseplants, that's all they want. And you can sort of lift up a smaller pot. If you can lift it really easily, then it does need more water. But on the whole, you want them to be moist but not sodden. And it's a good time to check the drain holes. Take a pen and shove it into the drain holes to make sure they're clear and the pot is draining properly. And this is just sort of it's like getting your sweaters out, right? You're getting ready for fall, you're getting ready for the cooler season, and you want your plants to come along with you. Anybody else got a because I did want to say a little something about the pollinator patch care, because that's another piece that, because a lot of us haven't been making, not everybody's been growing pollinator patches for a long time. Sometimes it's hard to get the message across that you need to leave not just, the leaves, but the whole schmatz. Like, you leave everything in place, because every stem might be harboring a butterfly eggs, or, that's where bees, sometimes some of the solitary bees, here in Washington, almost all are native, or 400 plus species of native bees. Almost all of them are solitary bees that don't make hives, but they do have little nests where they leave eggs and things. And if you're messing around and you find a little green, what looks like a little capsule made of round circles of leaves that are kind of carefully glued together, that's leaf cutter bees, and they're beautiful. And those are their little egg cartons, right? And so you don't want to mess up that kind of stuff. So in a pollinator patch, you literally let stuff go, and you let it go to seed first, because one of the things that will happen is the birds will come and eat, and not just birds, but a lot of other critters, like seeds are high in protein. And so there's a lot of animals, little critters, that will eat those. And so let everything go to seed, let everything go all the way brown, and you don't really do much of anything to it until like March, April, when you start to see new growth at the base. That's when you can. And if you think at all you've got some kind of wildlife stuff going on there, instead of cutting it all to the ground and putting it in the compost, you might cut it all to the ground and make a few little heaps toward the back, so that if somebody's alive in those stems, they can still hatch out, right? And if you just put it in little piles toward the back, they'll just molder down in their own time. But remembering that little bit of wildness is really important. If we want to preserve wild things, we need to allow them to be wild. Somebody just sent me this wonderful cartoon of somebody walking up to a gardener saying, "Wow, your garden is so messy. There's all this dead stuff in it and all these sticks." And she says, "Thank you. Yes, it's a beautiful habitat." And I love that. But, maybe if you get flack for it, you could make some cute signs that say, "Thank you. Yes, it's habitat," right?
Yes.
I love to leave things going to seed anyway, even kale and lettuce, because for one thing, you'll get more kale and lettuce, but you'll also see birds like crazy. And we have tons of birds on the sunflowers now, pulling the seeds out. And you'll notice, like, those heads, when they finally come down and you're taking them down, they're stripped. There's no ripe seeds there at all, because they've been pulled out carefully by the very happy birds, right?
Yeah, I have a lilac tree that I used to try to trim away, and it was a lot of work. And now I am used to looking at those sort of, leftover blooms, and the birds are in there all winter long.
Yep, I've seen that many times. Yeah, and those old-fashioned lilacs that set a lot of seed, those are magnets for some of the smaller birds. It's really cool. And so if you like to have a little life in the garden, let things go a little bit, and, take your glasses off. It's not that bad. And then you won't be irked by something that doesn't look as tidy as it might, but you'll be thrilled to have, little birds come in to visit all the time. That's pretty uplifting, right?
Mhm.
One thing too is like the hardy fuchsias are still going crazy. And that is something that is really worth remembering. Like, do not cut those back for several reasons. This year, a lot of people thought, after that cold snap we had in January, they were like, "Oh, my fuchsias are all dead." Well, if they didn't pull them out, most all of them came back. But if you leave them, you have several advantages. Again, the birds and the hummingbirds that like to winter over here really rely on those hardy fuchsias, and you'll see them all winter long on the hardy, even the hanging basket kinds. A lot of them, they're not quite bloomed out, and those I keep watering and feeding, because they're in a basket in the air, right? They're not getting anything from the soil, but as long as they're productive, they will be supporting hummingbirds like crazy. And then if we do get another big frost and the top growth is killed, if you haven't cut them back, only the top growth will be killed for the most part. And you'll find there are a few, like, what is that one? Orange Prince is very tender, and especially if it's in a pot, not in the soil itself. Some of them have been bred with some of the really tropical species, and they're not super tender. The long, skinny, tubal ones on the whole are not as hardy as the flary ones with the Ginger Rogers dresses, skirts. But pretty much, and actually the super double ones are not as good for the birds either. The old fashioned singular ones that just have the little skirt and the frills, those are the most accessible if you're a bumblebee or a hummingbird. You can get in there, but the ruffly double skirts are not as easy to access the pollen and nectar. So I don't grow those anymore. I pretty much stick with the single ones because I like to see a little life in the garden, right?
So you gave me some advice a little while ago about controlling moss in my back patio. It's like moss is beautiful. I don't mind it taking over the grass for sure. And the grass that I'm still leaving that I'm not replacing with the pollinator gardens,
Right.
pollinator patches. But you had some suggestions about sort of low impact ways to kind of keep your patio safe to walk on.
Yeah, because that one really important thing as we get a little older is that moss is slick, and it also tends to catch fallen leaves. And as they start to rot, then you have a little puddle of slick leaves with moss underneath them, which is really treacherous underfoot. So, and just, you can scrape or rake, or the more sustainable method is to cause that to be done by others. I think one of the first rules of gardening is it's all in the wrist. You say, over there, honey, get that part. Okay, thanks. Now this part. So you use your wrist. It's good, hand exercise, and you're not like, but if you're going to get down on your knees and do it all at the same time, and keep a 5-gallon bucket at your side, because once you're down, you got to get back up again. And you don't want to be up, down, up, down. One of the best pieces of advice I got from an older gardener was that she's like, check out all the stuff that needs to happen when you're down and do it all, and then get up and always have a bucket. So it's like, got it. And boy, that's such good advice, because sometimes as our knees are not so happy, or maybe our hips are not so happy, or, maybe your ankle is not so happy, getting up can be the funky part, right? So, but getting down there, so you can often, depending on what material the patio is made of, you can scrape off the moss, but a lot of times the roots are still entangled, especially in something soft like brick, that will still be in there. So at that point, you can do a couple things. Some people will power wash, which, you wouldn't want to do that on soil that was like a garden soil, God forbid, but on brick or cement where the roots can get in there, that's not a bad idea at all. And then the next step is to do the baking soda. And at some of the grocery stores, you can buy a flour sifter, which is a nice big container with holes in it, like a big cheese shaker, right? And you can put some baking soda in that and shake it directly where you want it. That's not going to be a super good thing to have in your beds necessarily, but it's good, really good thing to have on your patio, because it will change the pH to the point that moss is not happy there, and that will really help. And you can put it on your roof too, same thing, or cause, again, it to be done by others.
Yeah, probably I like that better for the roof for sure.
Yeah. That's, I think, and some people are putting ridge bands on their roofs with the copper in it, which will kind of stream down, but that's pretty toxic for the soil. So I'd rather just use the baking soda, which will get neutralized over time. And that, you can actually scrub, or, if you feel like it, scrub the bricks and concrete with a good stiff, like a wire brush that you would use for cleaning a grill, a barbecue, and a little soapy water. Again, that like Dr. Bronner's, or a gentle Castile-based soap, or dish soap like Joy or Dawn, they're pretty mild, and just scrub it down and then hose that off really good. And that will actually help take out some of those. But you want to make an environment that's less hospitable and safer underfoot. The other thing to really think about is that for steps and anywhere a painted stairway or painted patio, wood that's painted, you can actually get that sandy paint at a boat store, right, or you can have it mixed for you. And it's just it's a safe decking material. And I like to put that on stairs and patios, on stairs and decks, because that's really safe underfoot. and making sure that you don't let the leaves pile up there. Like I'm always saying, leave the leaves, but leave the leaves where they can do good, and make sure you do get them off where they're dangerous, right? And there's no reason you can't take those leaves and put them in the heaps like compost.
Yes, that's what happens with us. We are brushing off the porch and putting those leaves in the garden bed.
Yeah, because otherwise what starts to happen is, especially in a gravel driveway, is now you're creating places where plants can be happy. And you'll find that you've made wonderful little nursery beds by leaving leaves all along the driveway or all along the gravel path. And you'll find lots of things coming up. Now, that can be a good thing, in that you might find little plants that you like and you can transplant them out. But it's also like, who wants to spend their life weeding a driveway? That just like,
that may be that's the what do you call it? Sisyphus job.
It's the dark side of gardening, and that's something very few people really enjoy doing. But there's a couple things you can do. Once it starts raining, you can use the flame weeders, but you don't use those in the summer when it's dry. Obvious. I hope that's obvious. You can also get kids to help you. You can make sure you're raking that gravel pretty often and replacing it every couple of years, like adding more to it. That's huge. Especially longer driveways can be such a, they start to turn into country waysides, which is sweet, but it's not, if you want to drive down it, it can be kind of tricky. Right? Rita.
Yeah.
You ready to talk about the shovel?
Yeah. So
Rita, you're right. Rita, you brought some show and tell.
Show and tell. Rita and I both have. I was given one of these shovels last year, and Rita saw it and she had to get one too. And they are the best ever. Like, yeah, look at that detail. Okay, so this is a very heavy shovel.
It's heavy.
You can sharpen the bottom with a bastard file and keep it really sharp, but it's heavy and it's got those ridges along the side. And
right.
Look at the big deep flanges you can step on too, so that you can really get some weight behind it, especially if you're me. And they are amazing.
Then this is rounded. And the thing with this is I just dug out a root at the senior center with this. And it's great because you can chop the roots and then you can kind of see where it is. You can get under it and you can use it like a pry bar, because I have broken so many shovels with wooden handles. It makes me so mad. Then I have to go buy one, a new shovel, and it doesn't really work. This thing is just awesome. I have dug so many things out, and when you kind of slam it down, and then if you've got what I found, if you've got roots that kind of won't go all the way through, if you know where they are, the little feeder ones, you just take your clippers and clip those around and you can get it out. But it's the best tool because you don't need any other one. And you can buy them various places. And of course, and plug your ears on the favorite place, or the place that a lot of people buy them because they can get them delivered. I know. But a friend of mine, so I used this at my daughter's school on a cleanup day not long ago. And so she ordered one, but she said there's also one with kind of just a T handle, which I don't think, she didn't order that one. She ordered this, there's this round handle, and they are just awesome. It is the best tool.
Can you still read the label on it? Can you show because it's called the Root Slayer, right?
Yeah, I don't know if my label's, it's not on here. Oh, I covered it up with, I have a piece of tape on mine so that I know that this one's mine. But it's called Root Slayer. Oh, here. It's down here on this part of it, and it says Root Slayer. So you can call around, and like Wilco might have them, Cenex might have them.
Sometimes Ace, I think.
Yeah, I looked at our Ace and I didn't see one, but you can look around, or you can again, find it other places. But it is the best tool that you can invest your money in. It is the most awesome thing in the whole wide world.
And Rita and I have had so much fun with them. When we were changing out the plantings at the senior center and getting rid of old stuff, it was like, woohoo, these really make it easy. And everybody in my neighborhood borrows my shovel all the time. They're like, I hear people yelling, get Anne's shovel. because, and when you're trying to move a bigger plant or
Yes.
get rid of something that's really persistent, these are just the best ever. I love them.
Yes, we've got loose strife, which is bad news, noxious around this little pond we have. And it's like impossible to get out. I can take this thing and put it in there and, dig a couple out a day, and pretty soon I'll have them all gone.
We're going to work on the yuccas next. Right?
Yes, the
At the
yuccas
senior
are,
center, we have these persistent yuccas that just don't want to leave. And it's like they have really deep roots and they keep coming back and coming back. It's like,
they won't, yeah, that's next week. The yuccas are going to be gone.
Well, I hope you keep coming back. We appreciate you stopping by every month and talking about these various issues, Anne.
well,
Yeah.
and anytime you see me and Rita out there, or Rita alone, just stop by and jump right in, because we always love help and it's fun to do things together, right?